So all these talks that are presented here are really just for one purpose, and that is to point at the nature of life and the nature of self, because a recognition of the nature of life and nature of self delivers something very profound. But what it delivers that's profound is not only the recognition of self, but what it delivers in practical daily living. So an insight, a realization, is worthless practically if it doesn't deliver anything in practical daily living. And so rather than focus on the realization solely, it's worth focusing on what that realization delivers in practical terms. And at the same time as focusing on what the realization delivers in practical terms, we're also focusing on what the absence of the realization delivers in practical terms. So we can substitute the statement realization with understanding or knowing, and in these talks and many non-dual talks, the word understanding and knowing is not referring to a mental knowledge or a mental understanding, but a knowing of oneself directly by being what we are. So it's the one thing that we can know absolutely, because it's the thing, what we are, what I am, is the one thing that is not outside. So when I know myself, I don't know it as an object. I don't know it as something over there. So when we know an object, we know it as best as the perception from that particular point of view allows us to know it. So when we're being ourself, we know ourself completely, intimately, fully, at no distance, directly. I am. Not as a mental concept, but as apperception. Apperception is a word that we use which implies both perception and knowing. It's the same as being or I amness. It's our true nature. And the absence of realization we can call misunderstanding. And misunderstanding refers to an idea that we have about ourselves, a self-image, a mental projection that we live life through. And that mental idea of who we are is always way too limited and way too inaccurate to deliver what our true nature delivers. So the self, and we have the self with a capital S and the self with a small s. The self with the capital S is referring to what we are, our true being. And self with the small s often refers to the self-image that exists. And the self with a small s has the capacity, when it's present, to cover up the self with a big S. Probably because the self with the big S is just the background. And the self with the small s is content. And the nature of self with a small s demands certain attention. The attention is of very contracted sense of being. And so when the small self is on the image of awareness, awareness is forced to be completely aware of this identity that exists. This identity is essentially a set of beliefs, a set of thoughts. And in this teaching, that identity is broken down or summarized as the belief in personal doership. So the self-image that life has put in place, that is radically out of line with what our true nature is essentially a set of beliefs that are made up of thought, and the beliefs and thoughts effectively say, I am such and such. You can, if I probably can't sustain a louder talk, so if someone can't hear, it's probably better to come closer. Or we can all pray that the noise outside quietens down. You can even, if it's still hard, you can find one of these spots over here. So this self-image is essentially a set of beliefs. And as I was saying, it's referred to as the belief in personal doership. The belief in personal doership has two aspects to it. One is the belief that I am the body that is separate and independent. That's a very important part, because to some extent we are the body. The part that is particularly inaccurate is I am this body that is separate and independent, in complete control of everything that I do, I think, and I feel. So with that belief in place, that self-image in place, life is related to and seen through the lens of that belief. I am the body, a separate, independent entity, in complete control of everything I do, think, and feel. And the second half of the belief in personal doership is the belief that my completeness, my happiness, my wholeness is dependent on outcomes, dependent on pleasure or pain in the flow of life, dependent on circumstance being a certain way. And similarly, that being the second half of the belief, life is then seen through that lens and related to through that lens. So with the belief, that deep down belief, so when I refer to this, the beliefs of the self-image, I'm not referring to some sort of fleeting thought about who I am that we remember from time to time. I'm talking about a belief that is deeply, deeply ingrained at the deepest level, so that there's virtually no recognition of it as a belief. In fact, it's felt as absolutely concrete and real and who I am. And so, with this belief, which essentially becomes the idea of who we are, that is seen to be absolutely true. That's what a belief is. A belief is when the content of the thought, content of the belief, is assumed, taken to be absolutely true. So, summarizing the self-image, often referred to in other teachings as a mask, maybe. We live through the mask or the lens of a self-image. And once again, in this teaching, it's referred to as the belief in personal doership. The belief that I am the doer as a separate entity in complete control of everything I think, do, and feel. And secondly, that my completeness and my happiness is dependent on circumstance, will be found in the future when circumstance is a certain way. And so relating to life this way means that we see life as a threat to who we are when, from time to time, often, sometimes, life delivers pain, because the belief is I need circumstance to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete. And with that being the basis of who we know ourselves as, essentially there's a fear of life. The ultimate fear is a fear of death, because death is the complete assault on life, on our existence, as we know ourselves through this belief So it's not really a direct knowing. When we know ourselves through this belief, we have no contact with what we truly are. And the strange thing is that this belief has this great power to cover up the immensity of what we actually are, to obscure it. And so the process, which is a process that life started by putting the belief in place, because we didn't form the belief was formed for us as part of the body's genetics and up-to-date conditioning. Because as we'll find out, the belief I am the doer is completely false when we see life differently. So the idea that there's a belief in place, I must have done it, I must be the creator of the belief, is an assumption that the belief in personal doership would come up with. So what's being suggested here is the belief is there, but we didn't do it. This self-image, this false self-image, was put in place as part of the story of life. And in the same way that life put the belief in place, the self-image in place, by delivering certain circumstance in the flow of life that reinforced the belief, circumstance and the way that the experience, moment to moment, is designed to be experienced. In the same way, life can start changing the experience such that it starts to reveal a different sense of self, and it changes the conditioning. And the conditioning essentially is what the belief is. The belief is part of the overall conditioning. And when life changes that part of the overall conditioning, the belief is effectively changed. And when life dissolves the belief, the self-image is no longer there. And that which we truly are, which lies beneath the self-image, reveals itself. Now, what in practical terms, in practical daily living terms, does this self-image deliver? What it delivers is a set of feelings or thought patterns which we can refer to as suffering. Guilt, blame, pride is one half of the human suffering, and the other half of the human suffering is worry and anxiety and expectation and attachment to outcomes. So I'll put a full stop at that part and go to another key part of the teaching, and that is to ask ourselves, because we're talking about practical daily living, happiness in practical daily living. The question is to ask ourselves, I find myself as a seeker. It happened one day. I came across a book, I heard a conversation, I started asking questions about what is the purpose of life, what is the meaning of life. However it was for a particular individual, we realized at some point in time my interest moved from material gain, for example, to matters of spirituality. I now see that my life is dominated by this quest, this seeking, these questions, and I am a seeker, a spiritual seeker, moving around the world in search of something, reading lots of books, coming to satsangs, etc. If we don't ask the question, what am I really in practical terms looking for, which seems like an obvious starting point. However, if we look at the multitude of spiritual paths out there and the hundreds of thousands of spiritual seekers, if you ask that very simple question, so what are you really looking for? What you'll usually receive is an answer that comes from, well, this is the point. You get an answer that's not very concise, an answer that's not very clear. And if someone's going around with no answer to this question, or an unclear answer, sometimes an answer that is just a conceptual answer that's been delivered to them as part of spiritual teaching, sometimes very esoteric in nature. So sometimes the best that you'll get is, I'm looking for enlightenment. A word, enlightenment. Oh, so what is enlightenment? And then it might be, well, actually, I don't know. Or maybe it's an answer like, well, enlightenment is oneness with everything. Well, what does oneness with everything mean? Well, when I'm one with everything, I'll know the whole universe. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Why do we want to know the whole universe? Why would we want to be one with everything? So the point, this is not a criticism, this is more an observation of how this process unfolds. And in fact, this process includes the process of misunderstanding. So to ask this question, what am I really looking for in practical daily living? Let me put all the theory aside. Let me put all my concepts that I've gathered over the time aside. And look at my own experience. Come up with an answer for myself based on my own experience. The suggestion here is that humans, even though we're all unique on one aspect, are looking for the same thing. Looking for human happiness in this life. So happiness for myself right now. We start off seeking happiness in material gain. So the assumption is that my happiness is to be found in gaining pleasure. In spiritual seeking, the material pleasure is usually substituted by an idea of something wonderful. So we end up with a new expectation of gaining happiness through gaining something. And if we drop the ideas and look at something very simply and say, I'm seeking the gaining of something because I think it will give me happiness. If I look at what my unhappiness is, if I really put my attention on what my unhappiness is in day-to-day living, I'll find that my unhappiness, at the point when I can say, right now, I know categorically, I can say that I'm unhappy. In this situation, I am unhappy right now. And if we look at how we feel at that point in time, we'll find time and time again that what is present is one of these 5 forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcomes. Either in the form of a deep feeling or as a mental commentary. So we can say, I don't know what my happiness is, that's why I'm seeking. But from our own experience, we can verify what our unhappiness is. The suggestion here is that human happiness is simply the absence of human unhappiness. It's not the gaining of anything, but it's the elimination, the removal of the error that stems from the error of who we are. And the error of who we are is being defined here, is being put into fairly simple language, that I believe myself to be this entity. I see this entity as a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything I do. I see the other, therefore, as the same, a separate, independent entity in complete control of what they do. And I believe that my happiness, my sense of self, my completeness, is dependent on pleasure, 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 pleasure in the flow of life. And with that deeply ingrained belief, self-identity, we go through life, and when life delivers pain, as inevitably it will do, we're forced to blame the other if pain was delivered through the actions of the other. You, as a separate, independent entity, in complete control of everything you think, say, or do, hurt me. You could have acted differently. You hurt me by delivering pain. Pain is an attack on who I am. So you hurt me, I hate you. All of this happens in an instant. And what arises is a resistance to life as it happens to be unfolding. According to the concepts here, as it's unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, moment after moment, life is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, meaning life is a creation, created all in an instant, the whole of time, the whole of the story of life, created in an instant as an amazing divine creation. And what we are experiencing, what we are, is intrinsically one and part of that creation. We are characters within this amazing creation. A dream, a playing consciousness. So consciousness at rest prior to the manifestation. Absolute nothing, but not dead nothing. Potential creativity. Consciousness at rest at some point, because its immense creative potentiality has to explode into manifestation. The whole of the story of life, from beginning of time to the end of time. The Big Bang with all of the soup of chemicals and whatever, the forming of the universe is the beginning of life, the developing, the evolution of life. At some point, the existence of dinosaurs. All part of the story of life. The story of life, this creation, a story of evolution, a story of time and space. And at some point, the dinosaur was the vehicle, the most complex vehicle, that consciousness, in which this story arises, in which consciousness was functioning through. So it's a story, a playground that is created, and the consciousness in which the playground arises actually links into the objects, some of the objects, the living objects in the story, and functions through them, witnessing the creation it has created from the particular perspective of the vehicle that it is functioning through. So at some point, God was functioning through the dinosaurs. God, consciousness, interchangeable words, not talking about a man sitting out there separate to all of this, controlling strings. God has become the manifestation, has turned into the manifestation. And now, the story of life includes the development of a more complex vehicle, more complex portal through which consciousness links and functions through. And whatever happens in each moment is an unfolding of the story, an unfolding of the creation. So on page 4556, it was dictated that the leaf falls off the tree. Much like, in fact exactly like, a dream that arises in the, this is an analogy, a mirror down version of how we can see life, a dream that arises in the mind, which seems like an individual mind of the dreamer at night. So a night dream spontaneously, a whole world scene spontaneously arises in the mind of the dreamer. It wasn't there 1 minute. The mind of the dreamer was consciousness at rest. Not creating, not imagining, not manifesting. And in an instant, out of nothing, explodes a whole world scene, consciousness in movement. An ocean with birds and dolphins and people, characters saying certain things to each other, running around, jumping in the ocean, fighting, loving, feeling like they're completely independent, in control of everything they think and feel and do, needing life to turn out a certain way in order for them to be complete. Whereas in fact everything that's happening in the dream is completely dictated to by the consciousness in which it arises, completely dictated to by the creation which is the dream. And in an instant the creation subsides back into nothing. The dream, the whole world scene that was there, a beach environment or a mountain environment, the mountains, the ocean collapse back into nothing. So could it be that life, a creation, is exactly that? A creation in consciousness, meaning a creation in the mind of God, and what from within the creation seems entirely, absolutely, objectively real is in essence an experience, designed to be experienced exactly the way it's experienced. But when it's all said and done, the experience collapses back into nothing. Before the experience happened, there was nothing. After the experience happened, there was nothing. The consciousness in which the experience remains, ready for another experience to arise. So all of this being said, because we were talking about how life unfolds, when life unfolds exactly as it's destined to unfold, if the belief in personal doership is in place as part of the story, when the other does something according to destiny and delivers pain with the belief in personal doership, there has to be an explosion of blame. You hurt me, I hate you. And when we feel that blame, when awareness lands on that blame, what we find is that at its core, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. In the case of blame, at first it's an uncomfortableness with the other, but that uncomfortableness with the other, when we dive deeper, is felt to be an uncomfortableness with oneself. Because we are blaming the other, because the sense is that what they have done is an attack on who I am, that I have become less complete as a result of what they have done. So that means an uncomfortableness with oneself. And as life unfolds, and it so happens that our actions, or those actions that happen through us, deliver pain to the other, or deliver an outcome that is not what we would like, then we have to feel guilty for believing ourselves to be separate and in control, looking at the outcome and feeling like we are inadequate. We are not good enough. We have not delivered a good enough outcome, and therefore I am not good enough. And pride is based on the same principle of personal doership, but specifically in relation to those actions that happen through us that deliver pleasure or deliver positive outcomes. And then it's like, look what I have achieved, look what I've done, which on the surface doesn't seem like suffering, but because it's based on the same false image, false idea of who we are, it has to at its core be an uncomfortableness with oneself. It's a milder form of uncomfortableness, but once awareness starts landing on what uncomfortableness is, what suffering is, it becomes very clear that pride very quickly turns into guilt or blame. So there's the saying, the pride comes before the fall. Pride comes before the fall on the basis that if pride is there, the false self-image is there. And as soon as life delivers pain, which inevitably it will do, which means one day the actions that are delivering such great results, people love us because we're doing well. At some point when something happens and suddenly people don't love us anymore, not our doing, part of the destiny of life, with that same belief of personal doership that's looking at, look what I have achieved, with that same belief in place, then the negative outcomes, or the fact that people no longer like us, is going to be taken personally. And that's going to turn into guilt or blame.
Okay, thank you. As you were speaking this part, I felt to ask something.
Mm-hmm.
Because here there's a strong pride.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But not that I want to feed or go along with it. And when I investigate, the pride is an energy here to really defend, protect from the fear of humiliation, from the fear of a projection, of being mocked, judged. It feels like it defends.
Mm-hmm.
Pride, anger is a strong protection from any violence that can come from other persons. I don't believe this energy, like I don't know, but it's something strong.
Mm.
I'd like to share this.
Mm.
I'd like
Well,
to-
the good news is your pride is not necessarily as strong as you might think.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
the fact you're asking this question,
Yes,
the fact that you can acknowledge it like you just are, is already an indicator that when pride is really strong, there's no capacity for it to acknowledge it in the way
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
just acknowledged it.
yes. Just maybe to conclude, and it hurts very much when experiences in life humbles you, by force, by
Mhm.
the things that we go through. So the energy of this pride being hurt is very.
Mm.
So what I'm exposing to bringing is this, like, there is no desire to go along with this ego of pride, because
Yeah.
it's a misconception in
Yeah.
this, in
So
this
So
consciousness.
as you're saying, when we feel it, when awareness really starts to land on it, we realize it is an uncomfortableness. It is a defense. And at some point we realize, I've had enough of this. I don't want to live like this. Deep down we know that this isn't natural, to have to be fighting, defending all the time. And my suggestion is that pride is linked to its opposite, which is the very core of this belief in personal doership, that I suspect, or at least this is what was shown to me in the process I have. So I take it with a grain of salt, because whatever is shown is still experience. But I think it demonstrates how this whole experience of life has been set up, and that the core of the false identity is actually a lack of self-worth at its core. It's what, when I came across the word original sin in Christianity, I said I couldn't resonate with the way it's used in Christianity. But I found out later that the word sin refers to, in Latin, comes from the word error. So original sin means original error. And because the story of life as a creation tends to follow cause and effect, it's a story of cause and effect. So it's written with one thing happening in order to justify the existence of a consequence. And I suspect that the initial error, the original sin that is placed in humanity, is the original error of feeling like they have been kicked out for not being good enough. And one imagery is that the movement of going from unmanifest to manifest, the movement where consciousness links and functions through an incarnate body, feels like a very restrictive change in nature. And there is a feeling that I have been kicked out of heaven, in a sense, like kicked out of home to come here, which is all part of the story. It's all error. And from that original error of abandonment, the story then develops. And so deep down, we're trying to prove to ourselves, I'm good enough. Because the original error is saying, I've been kicked out because I'm not good enough. And so, in its extreme form, that leads to feelings of shame. Shame is the most intense form of human suffering. And then there's guilt, hatred, blame, etc. Pride higher up. Still, the root of pride is the same lack of self-worth, but in a much weaker form. And so if we come to see that we have this pride because we want people to know that we are good enough, which really means if they confirm that we are good enough, then that confirms to us, oh yes, I am good enough. Because we don't actually believe deep down that we're good enough, when that seed of lack of self-worth is in place. So if we see this movement of wanting to be right, wanting to be acknowledged, and fighting for that. So when someone with this lack of self-worth in place, if someone says to you, you haven't done a very good job, the automatic defense is to defend yourself against that. We defend ourselves because deep down there's this belief, surely I haven't done a very good job because of this lack of self-worth. And so there is the automatic belief to defend against the criticism, really because we believe it. We believe the criticism and it feels uncomfortable. If I explain it in its flip side, it might make more sense. Is that if we're completely convinced that the job we've done is really quite good, we have complete confidence in what we've done or what we're sharing, for example, and someone says, what you're doing is very inappropriate, you're doing a very bad job, from a place of absolutely no doubt, groundedness in what you're doing, that will be received, and it can be received graciously in a sense. It's like, okay, would you like to elaborate on where this is coming from, instead of an attack? Because you have no doubt about yourself, no doubt about the situation. And so the defending and attacking, which doesn't seem like on the surface, actually stems from a doubt that we have. So, and this isn't at all pointing specifically at you. This is a generic blueprint in a sense that's been put in place. So your awareness has already obviously landed on a lot of the dynamics here, that that pride is a defense, and that it's, or an attack. And sometimes it's a defense against a criticism, and sometimes it's trying to evoke some appreciation. So then awareness might look a little deeper and say, so why do I want that? And my suggestion is to look at the point that, deep down inside, I don't trust myself. I don't feel complete. I don't feel worthy. But that, when awareness lands on that, it's landing on the false self-image, because that is not what we truly are. And as soon as awareness lands on the next layer of the false self-image, we know what happens when something lands in the fire of awareness. It changes.
Yeah, then it doesn't matter, because it's very abstract.
Mm-hmm.
In his empty presence, there is no being good or being bad.
Yeah.
Even if something is proved that this expression is very bad for you, you're done a very bad job, then there is not caring at all. It's just happening in this layer, like you said. Sometimes I have this scene. Sometimes I have this scene, this awareness of being.
Yeah. So this is interesting, because there is, if the seed is there, the belief, it's true when we witness it. The suffering that stems from it, when it's witnessed, loses a whole lot of its charge. Because witnessing it basically sees it as an object, and it's known not to be what I am, because I am the space in which it arises, and it is a very limited thing, and I am not a thing. So when it's witnessed, it's not so important. The interesting part is that for it to have arisen, the seed is there. And for as long as the seed remains there, when we go through life, life is potentially going to trigger it at any point. And if it triggers it, that is suffering. And then we have to rely on the witnessing being there or not being there. If it's there, it's not such a big deal. If witnessing doesn't happen, then there is more charge to the suffering. And finding this witnessing position is grace. But if we hang out as the witness forever without thinking that there is something more to do, and there isn't something that a doer can do, but the process of life, once it ingrains in the body's up-to-date conditioning, that actually beyond witnessing, the process carries on. And the process is to feel the feeling at some point. So it's not about an instruction to feel all the time. It's about being aware that at some point, feeling this seed completely without labeling it as unenlightened, or without having a belief that I have to witness. So the witnessing perspective, which is not something the individual does, there is just witnessing, no witnesser. Often witnessing becomes another backdoor entrance for the ego. The ego, or the sense of personal doership, says, I am going to be the witness. True witnessing, which I think you're speaking of, is when the sense of personal doership and the individual falls away and there is just witnessing, no witnesser.
Yes, there is a natural feeling I'm not doing witnessing.
That's right.
It happens spontaneously sometimes.
That's very important for that to ground in, but at some point we can find ourselves feeling like that's the only position, that's the ultimate position. Witnessing is the ultimate position. And this is quite important because awakening teachings have to focus on this aspect only to create the shift to where witnessing happens. And at some point it's very useful to hear that the belief itself doesn't dissolve very efficiently when the position is just of witnessing. What happens very efficiently when the position is just of witnessing is that the feeling becomes less charged and dissipates in time. But the seed, the root, doesn't tend to dissolve very efficiently. What tends to uproot the root is to essentially put the idea of witnessing aside for a while and completely embody the feeling, whereby the aim is not to have the feeling dissolve into nothingness, because we've already seen that the feeling is not real and it will dissolve. So that's already become part of our understanding. I am not the feeling. But in order for the charge of energy to finally leave, which in the samskaras and vasanas are these energy blocks and beliefs in the system, for them to finally come out, there needs to be a combination of witnessing sometimes and at other times really just feeling completely the feeling.
Can I? So I don't know if so you mean not actually going and experiencing the feeling without fear of identification.
So say it again. I mean,
when you said to go into the feeling, not only witnessing, you mean like actually, for example, fear of whatever, of dying, for example.
Yep.
To actually experience it.
Exactly.
Go with it.
Yeah.
This is what you're saying.
Yeah. With, like you said just now, without the fear of dying, because the feeling tells us this is your death. So our intuitive movement from the feeling is to suppress the feeling, to do anything to make the feeling less intense, including witnessing. So at some point, witnessing becomes escapism. It becomes dissociation.
Yes.
Right? At some now, this is not witnessing is something that happens. It's a revelation of our true nature as formless awareness. It's so important for that to become a grounded experience of who we are. But it's a phase in the process. We don't live, in the end, integrated living is not living from the perspective of witnessing. Witnessing in a profound way happens to reveal to us what one of the aspects of consciousness is, one of the two basic aspects of consciousness. One is awareness, and the other aspect is being. And so witnessing makes it very clear experientially that what I am is the formless space in which everything arises. And at some point that's meant to dissolve. So witnessing isn't the ultimate standpoint from which daily living gets lived. So to hear that, to come back and really feel again is not a regression in the process, but it's complementary to this witnessing that has happened. So to feel without a fear of death, because the feeling actually tells us this is going to kill you. Do something about it. Once we know, no, this is never going to kill me. This is a feeling that I am dying. What the feeling is the feeling of the false self-image dying or feeling threatened, not the true self. So when we stick with it, and something inside of us is this fear of, this feeling of death is an illusion, that I can stick with the feeling. I don't have to run away from it like I always have, because I thought it actually will kill me. I can stick with it, and that means then we can be there and fully allow it to flower, which means you can then fully experience the lack of self-worth, for example, if it happens to manifest at this deep level. And what you could be expressing there is what wasn't expressed because there wasn't the space for it, either in your childhood or some other life experience that some other being, it wasn't your past life, a past life experience that ingrained this belief. You can express that. And in expressing it, what you're doing is transmuting energy from one form to the other. Now, the important part with expressing, there's a difference between expressing, because people can express all sorts of things. Someone who's angry can really express it, or hatred. They can express hatred, but it doesn't mean it releases it. When we release it is when we no longer consciously see life the same way we used to see life. So if we no longer see life as personal, I am the doer, the other is the doer, that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and we now consciously, meaning consciously, our belief systems have changed, or at least those beliefs have fallen away, the conscious ones. We now see life as a happening, like as destiny unfolding, and that if someone hurts me, it's my destiny to experience pain in this moment, and we see the other as the delivery method of my destiny. So it's much less personal, where I no longer hate the other for delivering pain to me. So if we've come to see life like this, when we express, we then see the energy from a different standpoint, and that means it can get released. If we express and we still believe the other is the doer and I'm the doer and my happiness, and then we express it and we hate the person even more, because we say, yes, look what he did to me to hurt me, he completely disrespected me, or whatever the situation was. And we remember it, and it just reinforces the hatred. So this is something that in non-duality often feeling is something that we think is, not moving in the right direction, that we need to keep. It's like one day when I master witnessing, or when witnessing happens in its fullness, then there will be complete impersonalness. And it's not it's very easy to see why those beliefs get put in place, because of the what the awakening teachings have to point at in order to bring about awakening. So if we then hear that actually what is enlightenment in practical terms, what is realization or liberation in practical terms, what it is not a oneness experience. What we're really looking for in life is happiness for Roger. What's your name? Satya. So what you're looking for is happiness for Satya. And it turns out that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. Buddha made it quite simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire. Desire in this case meaning the belief that my completeness is dependent on pleasure. And so then we crave that pleasure. Craving it because we crave to feel complete, and we think that that pleasure will complete us. And enlightenment delivers human happiness. It delivers the end of suffering, which turns out to be human happiness. Human happiness in the form of peace of mind, not in the form of attaining anything. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So in practical terms, if we conclude for ourselves based on our own experience, we've all had periods, especially after certain realizations, of this flip-flopping phase, where in the flip, we go through life, sometimes it's pleasure, sometimes it's pain. And when it's pain, we're surprised. It's pain, not in line with my biological preferences, so still pain, but we find ourselves okay with it. On a level inside, on an internal attitudinal level, we find it doesn't disturb us. It doesn't create an uncomfortableness with oneself. And then the process flops us into the flop phase. We wake up one day after feeling great for a week, and suddenly we don't feel so great anymore. Something small happens and we feel this resistance and uncomfortableness. And at some point we conclude from our own experience, actually all I'm looking for is the end of this flop, the end of this feeling uncomfortable. I'm not looking for any great bliss or anything like that. I just want to go back to where I was yesterday, where everything was just okay, even when things weren't working out perfectly. And that isn't necessarily delivered in the presence of a oneness experience. So then we can drop the idea that I'm waiting for the individual to dissolve. Because I'm sure many would agree that belief that enlightenment is the end of the individual, or enlightenment is oneness, that becomes a belief. It becomes an expectation, and when there's expectation, it's one of the forms of suffering. It becomes the obstacle to what we're really looking for. So if we have the belief that I'm looking for a state of oneness, that gets in the way of the end of suffering. And the irony of this process is that the process delivers oneness experiences. Experientially, we have a oneness experience where the individual dissolves and subject-object relationship falls away. It becomes totally clear that in the experience, what I am in essence is not the body. What I've always been is this formless awareness. And if someone came and attacked the body, it wouldn't touch who I am in the slightest little bit. And so when those experiences happen, it reinforces the belief, this is it. This is enlightenment. And then inevitably that experience fades away. And the conclusion in the brain is, one day it's going to come back and it will stay. It's just that the process hasn't yet reached that point. And I say this from my own personal experience. And I was very lucky to have a teacher, Ramesh, that understood the phase of this seeking and said, Roger, what you're really looking for is happiness in daily living. And happiness in daily living is simply the absence of suffering. And suffering is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, based on the belief that you are the doer, the other is the doer, and your happiness is to be found in outcomes. You're not looking for a oneness experience. True, in the oneness experience, there is peace. There is the absence of suffering. But what if the oneness experience is not something that is continuously available to you? What if that is just a peak experience to show you, to demonstrate something? If you maintain the idea that liberation is a oneness experience, then that belief is going to lead to frustration, because it's a belief about something that's not available. So what if you, for a while, experiment with the fact that it's not a oneness experience, and that in the end we live very much as Roger or Satya, feeling that we are separate from the table and separate from the other, feeling like in each moment we have free will to do whatever we feel like doing, but with the deep, deep knowing that whatever happens in each moment is happening because consciousness, the one consciousness of Source, is functioning through me, that whatever happens is exactly what's destined to happen. And with that knowing, there is a connection to Source. And the junction point where Source, impersonal consciousness, links to the body and functions through the body as personal consciousness, that junction point is the sense of I am. So we get to live life as Roger, doing in each moment whatever, live as Satya, doing in each moment whatever you think or feel you should do, whatever the circumstance dictates, with this connection, this realization of self, meaning that whatever you do, knowing that the outcome is not in your control, whatever you do, the outcome not in your control, and that is actually what you are meant to be doing, the only thing that can happen, and that the outcomes are not a definition of who you are. And so from that point, we live life happily, knowing that what we are is never something that gets added to or taken away. So at that point, the doubt is completely gone. Because the self, with the capital S, is one of these very unique things in life. It's actually the only thing that is ever present and unchanging. And when the being sort of turns in on itself and rests in itself, the recognition is that what I am is self-contenting, meaning that I am content at my core without circumstance needing to be a certain way. And each time we go there, there's a recognition that I am complete here. So it ends up being that our connection to Source is the source of our happiness, which manifests in practical terms as the absence of suffering.
What I feel you're communicating here inside is there's even space for playing as the belief of a doer, if deep there is a knowing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how it's flowing. For example, I'm doing some business, I'm making money, but there's even space for that in the realization. You don't have to force a plastic feeling of oneness.
Exactly.
Is a artificial realization to what I'm feeling. You communicating.
Mm-hmm.
It's what I'm understanding.
It means we absolutely don't have to be anything in particular. You can, like you said, is that life then in the ancient wisdoms, it's before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After, chop wood and carry water. Meaning you will carry on with daily life. And daily life means doing whatever needs to be done. At this point, there won't be an attachment to the outcome, meaning that we won't feel dependent on the outcome. And yet, just because we're not attached to the outcome doesn't mean that very positive things won't happen. And so when you carry on in business even, business is not non-spiritual. Spirituality is about life, and business is part of life. The way life works is based on an economic system. You need money in order to survive. So it makes sense that even with liberation, you're not suddenly going to find money growing on trees. You still will need to do whatever your circumstance, your destiny dictates. And so that is done now as if we are the doer. We have to live life as if we are the doer, as if we are in control, but with deep down, knowing that that is just the unfolding of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, there is a feeling here to put aside all this effort that happens to, no, I'm not the doer, like feels artificial.
Mm-hmm.
If something suggests to put aside this, because lately I've been kind of forcing to be in this feeling of I amness, and then it becomes another suffering, a struggle.
Sure.
And to put aside this doership, not doership, the desire to put aside doership, to give up, trying to be like empty of doership or not.
Yeah.
In other words, welcoming even the play of free will, but seeing from a very natural point that it's just an act. It's how it feels here.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. Even all these concepts I'm putting forward need to fall away.
Yes.
Yeah. Nothing that I say here is the truth. Nothing anyone has ever said in life is the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. And all these are just concepts, pointers. They're definitely not meant to be turned into a belief system. As soon as we turn them into a belief system, then it's I am the non-doer, and it becomes a new filter through which we live life. And that inevitably will happen for a time, but then awareness lands on the fact that even that is suffering, like you're describing. And when we realize, this new position that I've taken is another image again, another struggle to be this. And then the intellect, as you've very well described, realizes I don't even want to be the doer, and I don't even want to be the one that doesn't want to be the doer. I just am. Whatever happened, then life is allowed. We really allow ourselves to be as we are, and then we see the other, and we allow the others to be exactly as they are. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ramana's teaching.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what you're pointing at is the same when he uses the analogy. Do you use this thorn to remove the thorn that is embedded in your thumb? But then be sure to throw both thorns away. And so the thorn embedded in your thumb is referring to a belief that has been put in place about who you are and what you should do and what you shouldn't do and how you should act. And then a spiritual concept comes along and counters that. So it uproots it. Ideally, it uproots it and we throw them both away. What in practice tends to happen is that belief is uprooted and the concept that was used becomes the new belief.
Yes, I'd like to express that it's really a burden. The whole concept, non-duality, here feels very heavy too. So I try to it starts to feel plastic, like you're eating plastic food when you get attached to concepts.
Sure.
It's very it becomes a burden. It feels bad.
Yeah.
Even to repeat words that other teachers say. So I'd like, like you said.
But you realize it after it's become a burden, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's all steps in a sense. You needed to have the non-dual concepts come in.
Yes.
To uproot important. The first ones, and then for them themselves to become a burden, and then for you to realize, oh, even this is a burden.
Of course.
Yeah.
You have to be okay even with repeating them, living in them. With the second.
Yeah.
Could we say that in other words, what you said, it will be to not. It's all about identification. To not identify this. So, for example, I'm believing I'm a doer. If there's no identification with the play of the doer, it's okay. So there's witnessing of the doer, working, doing whatever, cooking. But this witnessing is not identified. It's all about this.
Yes, that's true. I'd like to jump on what you're saying to elaborate on some things. So when you say, and you referred to it a little bit earlier, that you witness the doer, right? Really, in the language I would use, is you are witnessing the body functioning, right? And also witnessing the sense of free will that is present, which says, and it feels like I am doing the dishes. So we witness, or that is seen to be happening, and the experience is there. Yes, it feels like I am, but there is a deep understanding that it's all happening mechanically, automatically. And that even though it feels like my doing, we know that that's just part of the experience. It's designed to feel like that. Even when there is the deepest realization of non-doership, the sense of free will remains. So the sense of I am doing the dishes remains, even when the most deep realization happens.
And this is okay.
That is not at all, the sense of free will is not at all our suffering. When I say the sense of free will, means the experience in the moment that I am speaking, right? It doesn't feel like I am nowhere. When I get up and open the door, the feeling is I am walking towards the door and opening the door. And that's not at all the problem. The problem is when a set of beliefs takes the experience, or or the experience is taken, and then a set of beliefs is formed. Oh, it feels like I am doing everything, and therefore I am doing everything. It feels like I'm doing it, therefore I must be a separate independent entity that chooses everything it does in each moment. And then that belief, which is inspired by the experience, it's put in place by the experience, becomes the identity, the belief system. And what changes is through certain realizations and observations and investigations, is the belief changes. The experience stays more or less the same. Where the experience changes is when the belief system falls away, that I am the doer. When that falls away, the suffering falls away. So the experience changes and that suffering falls away, but the experience that I get up and walk towards the door and open the door, that stays. And so much so, this is a very big point, is that we're waiting for the sense of the individual with the sense, the feeling of free will. We're waiting for that to dissolve. And it's not going to dissolve. In certain experiences it dissolves, because it's meant to, in certain experiences it dissolves to show actually this whole thing is an illusion, an experience. Because you can't dissolve unless it's an illusion, right? The individual in some experiences will sort of dissolve into oneness. And that's there to show us that actually the whole experience is just an experience. But then the experience is meant to come back and be one of an individual. without the belief that I am the doer. So now we don't witness the doer anymore, because in this teaching, the belief in personal doership refers to an attitude of doership, an attitude to what is happening. So once that belief has fallen away, doership has fallen away. But the experience of doing things remains, but accompanied by the deep, deep understanding, I'm not doing anything. So it's the paradox where I know I'm not doing anything, but then we live life as if I'm the doer. The experience is living life as if I'm the doer, not pretending. That's just how it happens. So this point of identification then, because this is about language as well, is consciousness, impersonal consciousness of Source, has linked to a particular body and is functioning through that body as personal consciousness. And it's doing that for everyone. And I'm using the word linked in this case. Impersonal consciousness is linked to a body and functioning through as personal consciousness. But actually one of the better words to use is impersonal consciousness has identified with a particular body and is functioning through it as personal consciousness. And that identification doesn't end. The problem here with language is so often in non-dual teachings is identification is used in a different way. In the way that you suggested, where we identify with thoughts, we identify with beliefs, we identify with feelings, we identify with experience. And so that identification, that falls away. But impersonal consciousness identified with a particular body and functioning through it as personal consciousness remains. And so in the scriptures we will see that it's referred to as identification with name and form. The human being is impersonal consciousness linked to a particular body, functioning through it as personal consciousness, and that creates identification with name and form. And so then Ramana, when his name is called, would turn and say, yes, how can I help you? That is identification with name and form, and it's not what creates suffering.
Yes. In the language that you speak would be the problem, is the belief.
Yes.
Identification is another process.
That's it, yes.
It's the belief.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really am the doer. This is the belief that is the problem.
Yep. And it becomes a bigger problem when we think that the other process that you're talking about, that we're talking about, it becomes a big problem when there is a belief that the identification is the problem. So the problem is the belief.
Yes.
But if there is a belief that the identification is the problem, then we're waiting for the identification to end. We're waiting for some imagined impersonal experience to happen, and then for us to live life like that. And that becomes a very big belief. That becomes an obstacle that has to be overcome. It gets overcome by, at some point, realizing it's true. I believe that one day there will be this magical lightning flash that takes away the person. The person isn't the problem. The person is what is here, that has been put here to live life. So in this teaching, the person, which is the combination of impersonal consciousness and the body, is the ego. And the thing is that there is an ego with the belief in personal doership, or an ego without the belief in personal doership. So the sage is still an ego, meaning impersonal consciousness identified with a particular body functioning as personal consciousness. But the belief in personal doership has fallen away. That belief in personal doership falling away reveals the connection to Source, meaning it's understood that it is the consciousness of Source functioning through me, and it's the same consciousness of Source functioning through everyone else. And when the belief in personal doership has fallen away, the connection to self is there, which means death is no longer an attack on who I am, because death is the end of the vehicle. And when the vehicle dies, the consciousness that is functioning through it just is unaffected. Very much like a red filter through which white light passes, and the other side is red light. The red filter is like the body, the white light is impersonal consciousness, and the red light is personal consciousness. And so you have either personal consciousness with a belief in personal doership, which is part of the body, part of the filter, or the same process but without the belief in personal doership. And so without the belief in personal doership, it's understood that the red light is actually white light, and that when the filter dies, the white light is unaffected. And with the belief in personal doership, it is unclear, it's not seen that the red light is actually an extension of the white light. It's seen that the red light stems from the body, that the body is the source of the red light. And so the idea of death, which is the complete annihilation of the body, is seen to be the complete annihilation of who I am. And that is the revelation that what I am is something that was never born and will never die. And so the fear of death falls away. The fear of death means that life can unfold moment after moment. Pain sometimes. And instead of pain being received as a mini death, which is how we normally receive it, that's why we resist it, pain is seen as an inevitable part of life that may well affect the vehicle, but is not touching what we really are inside. And the veil for all of this is the belief in personal doership. The thing that covers up realization is the belief in personal doership. So why I spend so much time asking the question, what are we really looking for? We're just looking for the end of suffering. And the end of suffering is the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation are based on an error. So that means that suffering in itself is an error, which is why suffering can come to an end, because all that needs to happen is life needs to correct the error. Once this becomes intellectually understood by us, awareness will land on guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation as it unfolds while we're just living our life normally. So we don't have to do anything special here. We just need to live life doing whatever we're called to do. And when guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation arise, awareness lands on it and asks. Awareness doesn't ask the question, but the working mind, the intelligent part of the mind, the thinking mind is where the false beliefs of self are, where all the suffering arises. The working mind is the functional part of the mind. And when awareness lands on guilt, blame, and pride, the working mind says, I know this is an error. What is the error that's happening? And very quickly it will see, I'm blaming the other for not having acted the way I want them to act. And that blame, when I feel it, is uncomfortableness, the very thing that I know is my unhappiness. And so this process can very quickly, once awareness lands on the core of the issue, the belief that gets in the way of realization can very quickly start to dissolve.
Something is coming here. I don't like to lower the deepness of what we are speaking, but it's something that is really a strong belief or worry. Because when I look at those kind of pointings and realizations, the big fear here is actually the physical pain. For example, one example of being in hard work, having challenges with cold weather, and also working in the sun, and this really physical struggle. So there is a fear, like I'm not in charge of what it might happen tomorrow. So the fear, so life will bring me physical suffering, physical struggle, and I cannot prevent this. So there is a feeling fear of a great fear here is of the physical challenges. For example, I don't have enough money to have a comfortable life, for example, if it happens. So what I'm trying to express is like there's a fear, for example, okay, these pointings are true, but there is a desire here, because I like to be sincere, even if it's a lower lowers down the level of the...
No, actually, it fits into exactly what we were saying.
Because I really I enjoy being sincere, and even if it's not. So the fear is okay. A desire, a strong desire to have a guarantee, a complete avoidance of all the physical struggles, whatever, cold, and sometimes struggling with sun, heat, some health problems that I have. So this fear of physical suffering, it stays here. And it challenges somehow this seeing, this knowing that we are talking about, saying, how are you going to do about this? Because you suffer. This is I'd like to explain.
So that fear, so just to put some words into, someone asked a question yesterday, he said, you don't, and it's a very valid question, that you don't use the word fear and you don't use the word judgment very much. And I know that a lot of teachings, especially even in my own path, at first it was all about love and fear. They were the, in terms of how it was presented, is misunderstanding is fear, understanding is love. And they were the benchmarks. And very clearly judgment is a form of suffering. We're aware that when we judge the other, there's suffering. So this question came yesterday, and it said, you don't really use the words fear and love, fear and judgment very much. Do they fit into guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation? So I'm just going to take the opportunity here to elaborate on that a little bit. The answer is yes, they fit into guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Judgment is essentially fits under guilt and blame. So when we judge the other, we effectively say, oh, you're overweight. You shouldn't have eaten so much. And especially maybe if someone is very like body conscious and does a lot of exercise, and they see someone overweight eating a big bowl of ice cream, the thought might arise, oh, look at you, no wonder you're overweight, you're eating 3 serves of ice cream, something like this. And we know when that arises, that's judgment. Effectively, judgment is blaming the other for being different to what we think they should be. So we blame them for not being or acting the way we would like them to act. So that hopefully explains, for the question yesterday, that and self-judgment is guilt, where we are eating the ice cream, let's say, and then the thought is, you see, you know you shouldn't eat, and here you are eating all this ice cream. And that is guilt. I'm not good enough. So it's blaming oneself. So judgment really fits under guilt and blame. And then fear is linked very much to attachment to outcomes, feeling that my completeness is dependent on outcomes. Meaning that as far as we're concerned, the best we can hope for in life, until we really start experiencing our true nature on a regular basis and experientially understanding what benefit that delivers, until that point, the best we can come up with is that my happiness is pleasure, 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 pleasure. And when that belief is deeply ingrained, pain is seen to be an attack on who I am. When the movement out of our head, because the fear is psychological often. It's a fear about something that might happen in the future. It's not a biological fear in the moment. If a snake, poisonous snake or monkey is, really hissing at you and ready to kill you, there's going to be biological fear in the moment. That's very different to what we're talking about here. Psychological fear and imagination of something in the future. when we're convinced that our completeness is dependent on outcomes, then we will fear the outcome not being in line with what we want. As the movement from head to heart, head meaning outside of the thinking, dropping into being. So I mentioned it yesterday, I think, Rumi's poem. Beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in the grass of that field, life is too full, or so full that not even words are needed. Something along those lines. Pointing to this field of being that lies outside of the thinking mind, outside of the continuous commentary of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And when there is a realization that this obsessive thinking about how the future will look, including anxiety and worry, when that's seen to be the obstacle to our true nature, the obstacle of peace, then it can get cut off from time to time, just by a thought, a wisdom thought that says, this is not helpful. And in the practice, which is not really a practice, that I suggest is the thought I am arises and cuts off the thinking. And we drop into being. And we find, here I am. Complete. And the more that we rest in that being, the more we understand, especially when we find ourselves in the midst of pain. And the commentary is commenting about the pain in the moment, and the thought I am cuts it off, and we drop into being. And in the midst of pain, in the midst of circumstance not being ideal, let's say we've missed the bus, or we don't have somewhere to stay at night, which doesn't often happen to people, even though the fear of it is there often. But let's just assume that something doesn't go right, which often happens to people, just milder versions of what we're really afraid of. So pain is, or circumstance is painful, we drop into being, and suddenly it's all okay. I'm here, and I'm complete. And the more that there is a resting in that being, the more that the belief that my completeness is to be found in the absence of pain falls away. So the more we rest in being, the more the belief falls away. So whenever you see that fear, which seems very justifiable, and it's true on a physical level, pleasure is much better than pain, no doubt. But the suffering which comes from our attachment to pleasure, meaning our belief that pleasure is what makes us complete, that suffering is additional to the pain in the moment. So whenever the suffering is there, for it to be known to be suffering, and that pain is only pain, and even in the midst of pain we find ourselves complete. At some point we're going to die, that's inevitable. If we die in certain process, could be painful. Now, having a fear of the process of dying makes sense. So pain in the process of dying is biological. But the fear of death itself is psychological. The psychological fear of death is the imagination of what has been lost in death. So we imagine that when I die, I am now missing out on all of the things that I need to be complete. So we try to leave a legacy behind, at least, so that we don't die off completely. So in our imagination, there is still something of me left. But in actuality, death is like deep sleep. No one's ever had a problem in deep sleep. So the fear of death is based on a psychological imagination of what death is that is quite out of line with what death is relative to our true nature. So this reverts back to your fear of pain. And the suggestion is that that fear is psychological, and based on the belief that my completeness is dependent on pleasure, 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 and that is supported by the belief that I am essentially the body. The realization and the abiding in I am, which demonstrates the formless consciousness aspect of the human being, the abiding in that place tends to provide experiential evidence that counters this belief I am simply the body and that my completeness is dependent on pleasure. So thank you. I enjoyed the chat. Come again.
Thank you very much. It was really, really great. I don't want to say the word helpful because it feels like an understatement because it's so great, but helpful in that way. It's helpful.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Very, very. Thank you very much. Thank you. Really, really good.
Good. There was a question that came to me, and a lot of people benefit from, and someone asked, what's the time? Okay. Someone asked, can you explain what the relationship or what desire or attachment for love, how that fits into the notion of non-doership? How desire or attachment to love fits into the notion of non-doership. And what I sometimes say is that so in answering that question, so I'll repeat it, the question was, can you please explain how the desire for love or the attachment to love, effectively that's the same thing, just using different words, can you explain how the desire for love relates to the notion of non-doership, which is what's put forward so often here, the belief in non-doership. And it's important to understand that the belief in doership, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the belief of doership has two arms to it. The first arm is the belief in personal doership, and the second arm is that my completeness, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, in pleasure. So that's what we've just been speaking about. Now, what I often mention is that the attachment to pleasure ultimately stems from the deepest attachment, which is the attachment to love. And why the attachment to love is there is going back to what I started off with, which is this deeply ingrained belief that I'm not good enough. The original error that's been put in place into humanity, into this life experience, that I'm not good enough. And so when we feel shame or I'm not good enough, the feeling is telling us you're not lovable. And what a feeling tells us is what the answer is. The feeling says, this is the feeling, and in the feeling it tells us what the answer is. But because the feeling is an error, the feeling is based on a mistake, the answer that the feeling gives us is also an error. And so when we feel not good enough, that we're not lovable, the answer is find out that you're lovable. That's what it drives us to do. So often, in practical terms, people are craving for a relationship, craving for a soulmate, because that's what the feeling is telling them the answer is. It says, when you find your soulmate, everything will be okay. And where that feeling is coming from, when you find your soulmate, everything will be okay, is a deeper feeling that says, I'm not lovable. And then that feeling creates the solution. Find a soulmate. If you find a soulmate, it means you are lovable. And if you are lovable in experience, then this feeling must be wrong and it will dissolve. And we know intuitively that this feeling that I'm not lovable is deeply uncomfortable. So once again, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And as I see it, it's the root of human suffering. It's the root of the personal self-image. And so this attachment to love, which when we look at our own experience, invariably we'll find it. And all the other attachments to other forms of pleasure are essentially attachments to love. So if we are successful and we can show the world that we are successful, then we'll be appreciated by the world for our success. And if we're appreciated by the world for our success, finally we will be loved. And if we're loved, then this deep, deep feeling of not being lovable will be proved to be wrong, and it will dissolve. And the irony is that we don't need the world to love us in order to be complete. The completeness already exists. It's just that it's covered up by this error of who we are. The error drives us to seek happiness out there. It drives awareness outward in exactly the opposite direction to where the solution will be found. And so the dissolving of the error, the dissolving of the belief, which starts up at the higher levels of our conscious experience, meaning awareness starts landing on why we want success, why we want material gain, why do we want to buy that new car or the new clothes and look a certain way, essentially so that we can feel like we are good enough and good enough for the other to love us. This is not absolute. There's nothing wrong with cutting your hair and buying a pair of clothes, some clothes that you like that you look good in, but that will probably happen when the sense of personal doership falls away. And when the sense of personal doership is there, there's likely to be this motivation behind certain things. That is a motivation of trying to gain love from the other. So the issue here is not the act of buying clothes, or it's more the attachment to what we think will come from achieving something. And so a lot of our motivation, when we look at it, we can see, actually it stems back to being lovable. So even arguing to be right, defending against another's attack or criticism, wanting the other to do things that we want, because if they do what we want, then it means that they respect us, it means that they love us. So this feeling attacked when the other doesn't deliver what we want is there because ultimately it's an attack on me by you not loving me. And so the answer in short is that this attachment to desire, the attachment to love, is very much linked to this idea of identity of being the doer, and it fits under this category of belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes, and the outcome that we believe will complete us the most is the outcome of love. And as I mentioned, that is not the solution, it's the imagined solution. And when those beliefs fall away, what we find is left in the absence of any belief is what we truly are. We rest in being and we find, there I am again. And I don't need anyone to confirm me, because I know I am. I am independent of what the other thinks of me, independent of whether the other behaves a certain way, independent of whether the other appreciates me or not. I am. So in wrapping it up, we don't need to go anywhere. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to wait for some magical time in the future. That what we always have been and what we always will be, what will be realized at some point, is here right now. There's no reason why it can't be seen right now, although, depending on destiny, that's the reason why it is or it isn't. But when it's seen, there never was anywhere to go. There never was anything to do. There never was anyone to correct, anyone to improve. The core of our being, meaning the essence that is there in each moment, that creates the sense, I am, whatever is added on to the I am. There's, if I ask the question, are you dead? You don't need to think about it. Your experience tells you, no, I am. Or we would say, I am alive. But the reason we say we're alive is because there's this I amness that's functioning all the time. And the second aspect of our being is the function of awareness, which means the function that sees my hand right now, that sees any object. So when daily life experience is being had during the day, there is awareness all the time of whatever the objects are. So even if the awareness is of excessive thinking, there is complete awareness of the obsessive thinking. And then if from the obsessive thinking we look at the clock or the children, there is awareness of the clock and the children. So there can't be awareness of anything in the absence of the core of who we are, which is the consciousness of Source. And if we realize that, then we will realize that I have to be here. I am here. It's strange when you think about it, where this process in its most intense form creates the sense that I'm lost. I need to find myself. As though there are two, one that's looking and the one that's lost. And we realize, where could I have gone? I can't go anywhere. I am me. The thing is that the core of the important core is not recognized as the awareness and the sense of existence, because of the identification in the form that you were speaking of, because of the identification with what is happening in the flow of life, identification with the beliefs and the thoughts, this is who I am. And so the very subtle, they're not actually that subtle, they're ever present, unchanging, the quiet aspects of the experience, the sense of being and the function of awareness get overlooked. And so self-realization is the self-realizing itself as the function of awareness and as the function of being. That's the consciousness becoming conscious of itself, or awareness becoming aware of itself. And it's here right now for everyone. No one is missing anything for complete happiness in daily living. Because all that is needed is the core that is functioning through everyone at every moment. To know that there's just an obstacle in the way of that, and the obstacle is beliefs, and the way that the beliefs dissolve is when awareness lands on them. And landing on the belief is hard because the belief is deeply ingrained. Landing on the manifestation of the belief, the flower of the belief, is much easier. The flower of the belief is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Awareness lands on that, asks, why is this happening? It becomes very clear that there's a story, and we see at the root of the story the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So, thank you, everyone.